your host, Dr. Amanda, and you're in the right place if you're a growth-minded entrepreneur who's ready to align your energy, mindset, and habits to manifest a life and business you love. And today we're talking about a really important topic because so many people struggle with this. According to a recent study by the International Journal of Behavioral Science, it is estimated that around 70% of people experience imposter syndrome at some point in their lives. And I really think that for entrepreneurs, this is an even bigger problem because when you're building a business, so much learning curve triggers a lot of fear and doubt and uncertainty and a lack of confidence. I've seen people who come out of really high power positions and they're really confident in those positions, and then they step into entrepreneurship and all of a sudden they worry that they're not good enough and they struggle with imposter syndrome. So today I'm going to give you 3 reasons imposter syndrome is killing your entrepreneurial success. We're going to talk about some of the symptoms that you can look for, how it's killing your success, and then I'll give you some action steps. And at the very end, I'm going to give you the top 4 books that I read at the beginning of my entrepreneurial journey that helped me build my confidence and eliminate, or let's say dramatically reduce imposter syndrome. Sure, sometimes I still freak out and wonder if I'm good enough. I just now have tools to overcome it much more quickly. So you're going to get a lot of gold out of today's episode. I'm glad you're here. Let's dive into imposter syndrome. So just in case you didn't know what imposter syndrome is, it is a term that's used to describe a psychological phenomenon where a person doubts their own abilities and accomplishments because they feel like a fraud, even in the face of contradictory evidence. So imposter syndrome plagues all versions of people. It's not just people who aren't doing great in the world. It's people typically that are doing really well, that are high achievers, and they mask it pretty darn well. And you would never think that they have imposter syndrome. This is one of the things I was most surprised by when I started my business. As I'd work with these high power people who, from my perception, had it made. They were making money, they had big houses, they were successful. And I'd sit and coach them and I'd realize, oh my God, everybody struggles with a lack of confidence and imposter syndrome in big ways where they worry that they're not good enough, even though they have wildly massive success in their lives and their businesses and in their careers and with making money. And so this is really common. So if you are struggling with this, you're not alone. It's very, very typical. And typically high achievers feel this way because they hold themselves to such high standards. The term was first coined by 2 U.S. psychologists back in the 1970s, Dr. Pauline Clance and Suzanne Imes. And they were working on research studying high-achieving women. And the paper was titled The Imposter Phenomenon in High-Achieving Women, Dynamics and Therapeutic Intervention. So they were looking for ways to help high-achieving women break through this phenomenon, and they wanted to understand it better. And they wanted to understand mainly why these high-achieving women felt like they didn't deserve their success, and their results were incredible. And since that time, imposter syndrome has become a very common term. And like I said at the beginning of the episode, the International Journal of Behavioral Science found that 70% of people experience imposter syndrome at some point in their lives, and that the phenomenon is not restricted to a specific gender or age or occupation, and it really can affect anyone regardless of their level of success or education. So let's talk about some of the symptoms that come up when you are experiencing imposter syndrome. Number 1, the thing I've noticed the most is procrastination, perfectionism, analysis paralysis, negative self-comparison, and too high of expectations, and infomania, meaning you think you need to learn everything, to know everything so that you always have the answers. And so you get a lot of credentials, you take a lot of courses, you think that you need to know it all. And so I lump that into number 1 because they go together very powerfully. Typically, when you have imposter syndrome, you're going to procrastinate because you're afraid to look bad. And so it's almost this self-sabotage strategy where you go, well, if I don't ever put anything out there, no one can judge me for being a failure. And this leads you to overly perfect things and have analysis paralysis. And a lot of this is because you're negatively comparing yourself to the people around you, thinking, oh, they're way better than me. I got to get better so that I'm as good as them. When in reality, they're probably feeling the exact same way, which is funny to think about, right? They're struggling with imposter syndrome, but you're looking at them from this perspective of putting yourself in the pit and them on a pedestal and thinking that everyone else is better than you. And you probably are also comparing yourself to people that are way ahead of you in the game, meaning they're years ahead of you in business or whatever area of expertise you're in. And they've had a lot of time to get better and better and better over time and quote unquote, perfect themselves, meaning it looks good on the outside. That doesn't mean they feel that way on the inside. Maybe they do. They're rocking it out. They feel confident. Just know that pretty much everyone I've ever seen goes through periods of imposter syndrome when you're building a business, because at every new level of scaling, there's a new level of you to discover, and there's a new level of you to break through. There's a new level of money making. There's a new level of learning and skill set. There's a new level of interacting with other people. And you've probably heard people say this before, at each new level is a new devil. That's really how it works until you break through to that next part of yourself. And so it's really common, and it makes sense that we experience these things. Other ways that imposter syndrome is going to show up: you feel like a fraud, okay? So you don't really believe that you deserve your success. You attribute it to things outside of you often. So you'd be like, oh, well, I got a hookup or a deal from that person, and they are the ones who created my success, instead of owning that you met the person who gave you that win-win situation. You might attribute it to your partner or just someone in your life instead of yourself, or something that happened instead of yourself. You have a fear of failure or making mistakes. So people who struggle with imposter syndrome will be really worried about making a mistake and how other people will judge them for making those mistakes. You would also believe that others are more competent than you. So like I said earlier, you're going to hold yourself in the pit and pedestalize other people, meaning, you hold them on a pedestal and you think you're worse than everyone else. You're going to discount your accomplishments and attribute them to luck or external factors, like I was talking about before. You set excessively high expectations for yourself. And I really think of this as an unconscious sabotage strategy, where you go, you achieve a goal, and then you set the next goal right away without even celebrating your wins, because you're never quite enough and you've got to prove yourself. So you've got to always up the ante, which causes you to be in this constant state of stress and continuously feeding the money block belief that you've got to work hard to make money. And so if you always raise the bar and set excessively high expectations, it's like cracking the whip on yourself at all points in time, which means you never feel ahead and you always feel behind, which degrades your confidence and makes you feel bad about yourself. Another way this shows up is being overly critical of yourself and your work. So you hyper analyze everything you're doing and you think it's not good enough, and you're worried what other people will think and if they think it's good enough. And that inner critic voice gets really loud with imposter syndrome. So the inner critic wants to beat you up and think it's not good enough. I'm not enough. The work I do in the world is not enough. This causes over deliver and undercharge problems, or overworking and getting underpaid problems. So you will work a lot harder than other people who have learned to manage imposter syndrome or who don't experience it at all, which is a small percentage of people. Another way it shows up is that you will avoid challenges or opportunities that may expose your perceived weaknesses. So it's like you play small, right? You play small because that way no one will ever learn that you're a fraud, and they'll never discover that you actually don't know what you're doing. That's what you believe. You're like, oh my God, if everyone just knew that I totally have no idea what I'm doing, they would see that I'm a fraud and they wouldn't want to work with me. And so I'm just going to play small and just get by so that I never have to be in the spotlight, so it doesn't expose that I'm a fraud. So that's how this cycle goes in your mind. So if these are coming up for you, don't beat yourself up. That's not helpful. Just know that these are the symptoms of how it will come up for you. Now I want to talk about actually some gender differences. This is really interesting to think about. In one study I read, and I'm going to grab this book because it's really good. There we go. Okay. It's by Lisa Obrey Austin and Richard Aubrey Austin. I think that's how you say their name. And actually, she's been on the podcast. I did not look back at the episode, but she is a rock star. She studies imposter syndrome, self-doubt, and how to succeed in life. And her story goes back to her own academic background, which she talks about academia as being, I don't remember if she uses this exact phrase, but it's how I phrase it, is that academia is like a petri dish for imposter syndrome, because there's a lot of competition and a lot of hyper criticism and a lot of need to be perfect in order to achieve and succeed and publish and all these things. And so she does a great job of doing research. And in her book, she talks about gender differences. And it's really interesting because one of the things she found was that the way that men tend to mask their imposter syndrome is that they play small and they won't go for the big opportunities so that no one will discover they're a fraud. Whereas women will tend to overachieve and say yes to everything to try to prove that they're good enough and that they deserve it. And so that was some of the gender differences that she saw. And I definitely see that. I see it in both, but I can see how she came up with those findings. It's really interesting. If you want to read her book, it's called Own Your Greatness. Really cool book. Okay. Here are 3 reasons that imposter syndrome is killing your entrepreneurial success. And the reason this matters is because it's causing slow business growth. When you are struggling with imposter syndrome, you are going to continually slow down the growth of your business. Because remember, when people come to you as an expert, the reason they're coming to you is because you're confident in the solution that you provide to them. And realistically, they're buying your confidence. And imposter syndrome is really the antithesis or the opposite of confidence. When you have imposter syndrome, you don't believe in yourself, you don't trust yourself. My version or definition of confidence is to know, love, and trust yourself. So when you know yourself, you know your gifts, you know your why, you know your values, you know your zone of genius, you know what makes you thrive, you know your weaknesses. And when you trust yourself, you trust, hey, no matter what, I can figure it out. I'm willing to figure it out. I believe in myself that I can figure it out. And when you love yourself, obviously you're going to go, I love all sides. I know all parts. I trust that I'll figure it out. I like who I am and I'll figure it out. Mistakes don't matter because I know that they're on their way to my success, and I believe in myself, and I'll face my fears because I trust that I can do this. Whereas imposter syndrome says you're not good enough. Hesitate, don't do it, don't put anything out there because people might judge it harshly. They might see that you're a fraud. They'll realize you're not good enough, right? So the opposite of imposter syndrome in my mind in a lot of ways is confidence. And so let's talk about the 3 reasons that imposter syndrome is killing your success and why it slows growth. And then I'll give you some action steps. So number 1, slow brand development. Okay, so imposter syndrome affects your brand development because you have low content production and you second guess. So when you're second guessing, it's going to cause you to procrastinate. The perfectionism that you experience and the analysis paralysis causes you to not put a lot of content out there because you don't want to be judged harshly. And because, when you're procrastinating, that takes up a lot of energy. When you are struggling with perfectionism, it takes so much time to produce content. And so your brand development is going to be slow because you're not just getting out there, making mistakes, figuring it out as you go, getting feedback. The less you put out, the less exposure you have, the longer it takes to create a solid brand identity and to be known in the world. And so slow brand development is one of the negative outcomes of imposter syndrome. Another one is that you're going to have decreased profitability. Okay, so part of this is because you're going to be fearing your failure and thinking you're not good enough and negatively comparing yourself to people who are ahead of you. So it makes you think that you need to know everything. So you tend to overspend on over learning. Now, I love learning. Learning is in my top values. I learn every single day, and I think everyone needs to learn every single day. The difference between learning to grow yourself and learning to feed your imposter syndrome is what matters here. And when I say learning to feed your imposter syndrome, what I mean by that is when you think you need to know everything so you have all the answers before you can even get started, or when you use learning as a form of procrastination. So this concept of procrastinating, where you go, I don't know enough yet. I've got to make sure I know everything. And so I'm going to buy every course and get every credential, and then I'll get started. And then most people never start. And so don't let learning be an inhibitor and slow your growth and decrease your profitability. Instead, let learning enhance your profitability and keep you moving in the right direction. So if you notice yourself overspending on courses and you're one of those people who buys every course and you hear yourself saying to yourself, well, once I know this, then I'll put that out there. Or, oh, I've got to learn this now, and then I'll put it out there. Instead of, if you were just learning from inspiration, you'd be like, oh, I can't wait to learn this, to add this to my toolkit, to work with more people. It's not a fear-based learning, it's an inspiration-based learning. But when you're struggling with imposter syndrome, it'll be tainted with fear, where you'll feel like you have to know in order for people to take you seriously, or to think you're good enough, or for yourself to think you're good enough. So just notice the nuances there and pay attention to, am I overspending to soothe my imposter syndrome, which is going to lead to decreased profitability, because your ROI will be lower because you're going to have slow content production, slow brand identity. You're also going to be spending money on too much learning, or other, you're thinking like other people know the answer and you'll never know the answer, so I got to keep buying stuff, that kind of thing. So decreased profitability and slow brand development. Number 3, stress and burnout. Okay, this is pretty obvious because when you're overworking to prove yourself, or you're overworking in procrastination, procrastination takes a lot of energy. It sucks and drains your energy. Your brain is the largest user of energy in your body. And when you're using your brain to think up ways to procrastinate, and then you beat yourself up because you're procrastinating, it takes a lot of energy. So you're actually working pretty hard. You're making it be more effortful than effortless when you are procrastinating. And then what happens is you'll stress out and go, oh my God, I got to get this deadline. And then you start to overwork, and then you want to prove yourself, and you're negatively comparing yourself, and all of this leads to long-term stress and burnout. And remember, when you're in a constant state of stress and overwhelm, you're sending the signal vibrationally to the universe that you have too much on your plate already, so don't send me opportunities. Okay, so know that if you are in a constant state of stress, the universe is reading that as not a good time to send you opportunities, because you have a vibrational frequency that's low and somewhat stagnant and not open. And so you want to make sure that you play with this and do what I'm going to tell you now in these 3 action steps. So first, recap. 3 reasons imposter syndrome is killing your entrepreneurial success. Number 1, slow brand development. Number 2, decreased profitability. And number 3, stress and burnout. Okay, now for your action steps, this is a simple one, but it works so well. And it's an affirmantra I use. If you don't know what affirmantras are, read my book. Just go to IamAMoneyMagnetBook.com and you can get free chapters, IamAMoneyMagnetBook.com. So affirmantras, I love this one. I started this one when I was struggling with imposter syndrome when I started building my business, and it worked so well for me. It just started with screw perfection, just get started. So today, let's play with this one. Screw imposter syndrome, just get started. Screw imposter syndrome, just put it out there. Screw imposter syndrome, just create the minimum viable product. And what I mean by that is it good enough? It doesn't need to be perfect. It doesn't need to rock the entire planet. It just needs to be good enough. It doesn't need to be your end all be all one thing that's going to transform the entire universe. It just needs to be good enough to make an impact on the people that you're seeking to work with. And when you put it out there, it'll start to attract new people, and then you can just scale up as you go. You don't need to have it be perfect. It's the minimum viable product. And when I started using this and teaching my people to use it, it's amazing how much more productive you can be in a positive way instead of just doing busy work. You're like, okay, screw perfection. perfection, just write the newsletter. Screw perfection, just do this social media post. Screw perfection, just make the next call. Screw perfection, write my email to this person to follow up. And it doesn't need to be perfect. I can't tell you how many times I put stuff out with typos and I look back and old versions of me would have beat the shit out of myself. And I would have been like, oh my God, people must think I'm a moron. And I would have just all day freaked out about it. And now I'm like, well, nobody's perfect. Screw perfection. And I'll say that to myself a lot. Screw perfection, screw perfection, screw perfection. It's such a great mantra. Okay. Second one is to use Parkinson's law. So this is another way to combat imposter syndrome. Parkinson's law. So Parkinson's law states that work expands to fill the time allotted. And so what you want to ask yourself is, what's the maximum amount of time to create the minimum viable product to get this project out? And you want to sit down and you want to map that out and go, okay, let's see, it's a social media post. And let's say you struggle with creating a post and you typically take 2 hours and you overthink it and you think it's got to be perfect. And so you spend 2 hours doing it later to get 2 or 3 views. And you're like, oh my God, I spent all that time. And in some ways that's a procrastination strategy, right? Because you don't know what else to do. And so you spend 2 hours on a social media post, making it perfect. And instead, you could use Parkinson's law and go, okay, I'm giving myself 20 minutes to get this post out. I'm setting a timer. Once the 20 minutes up, I'm finishing it up. And that way you use your time efficiently. This starts to create a feedback loop to your brain of confidence because you're like, oh, I got it out there. Now I can do the next thing. And it starts to shift your experience of letting yourself put it out there. And while you're doing this, you definitely want to use that for mantra, screw perfection or screw imposter syndrome, just put it out there. And that way you can use your time powerfully, be more productive, increase your profits, increase your exposure, increase your brand identity, and that'll help you start to shift through some of this imposter syndrome because you'll start to get results and feedback that help you see that you're making a difference in the world, which reduces imposter syndrome because realistically, when you think you're a fraud and not helping people because you're not making enough contact with people, that increases your imposter syndrome. When you start getting feedback that people are like, oh my God, this is awesome. You're helping me. I want to talk to you. That makes you go, oh my God, I do know what I'm doing. And that starts to shift the energy around imposter syndrome. Okay. The last things in terms of the action steps is to learn everything you can to develop your confidence, okay? Learn everything you can to develop your confidence. And just like I said earlier, confidence is the opposite of imposter syndrome. So here are the 4 books that I came up with in addition to the Own Your Greatness book. The first one I read, and this is going to sound a little funny and counterintuitive, but it was Codependency for Dummies by Darlene Lancer. I had really bad codependency issues, which in a lot of ways is a lack of confidence problem because I was doormatting myself, and in relationships, I would just create my identity around the people I was with. And so that book changed my life. So if you struggle in relationships to be someone who is constantly putting yourself aside and overly pleasing and doormatting yourself, this book could be a good book for you. Codependency for Dummies by Darlene Lancer. All the links are in the show notes and the description, so you can click on links there. The Art of Extraordinary Confidence by Aziz Gazipura. So The Art of Extraordinary Confidence. This one was awesome. And I actually found him through his podcast. I don't even know if he still has it. It's called Shrink for the Shy Guy. And obviously it's for guys and I'm not a guy, but I listened to that one and it rocked my world and was so helpful. And then I found his book and read it and it was really, really helpful. So The Art of Extraordinary Confidence by Aziz Gazipura. He's a confidence coach for guys. You Are a Badass by Jen Sincero. She is hilarious. I would imagine a lot of you have read her book because it's very popular, but if you haven't, that book is so great. It's such a great, she does such a great job being comical about the way she experienced herself, and then she gives really practical, actionable tips and strategies to increase your confidence. So You Are a Badass by Jen Sincero. The last one is not directly related to confidence. It's more about just not giving a fuck. So The Subtle Art of Not Giving a Fuck by Mark Manson. If you haven't read this one, you will be surprised. I was actually really surprised by it. I'd heard of it for a long time and then I was like, I'm going to check this book out. And it is filled with tips on confidence development and just letting go of your overthinking things and caring so much about what other people think. So The Subtle Art of Not Giving a Fuck by Mark Manson. So those are the 4 books. So let's recap. 3 reasons imposter syndrome is killing your entrepreneurial success. Number 1, slow brand development. Number 2, decreased profitability. Number 3, stress and burnout. And the 3 action steps that you want to use to combat this and start to break through your imposter syndrome is Affirmantra. The Affirmantra screw imposter syndrome. Just get started. Screw imposter syndrome. Just put it out there. Screw imposter syndrome. Just create a minimum viable product. Number 2, use Parkinson's law to master your time and start putting out more content and getting more done in the 24 hours that you have to build your business per day. And then number 3, learn everything you can about developing your confidence, and then read those 4 books. All right, that is a deep dive conversation on imposter syndrome. This is something that I work with people on in my business every single day. And it's something that all people struggle with that I've worked with. So if you are struggling with this, you're not alone. And also know that there are solutions, and you can completely transform yourself by starting to take action to reframe from imposter syndrome to confidence. And I believe in you. You're awesome. Thank you for being here. And until next time, I'm sending you giant hugs and inner power high fives.